Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today, looking at the global market for a specific pharmaceutical, Busulfan.
Got it.
We've got some really interesting numbers here, pulled from a market forecast report. It looks ahead all the way to 2033.
Mhm.
And our mission really is to get behind that data, figure out the key trends, the market size now, where it's heading, and crucially, what's actually driving that growth.
And Busulfan, based on this report, it plays a pretty vital role. It's used mainly in chemotherapy conditioning,
Right.
specifically before patients get bone marrow transplants.
Mm-hmm.
And the demand, well, the source links it directly to rising cancer rates globally, which, often lead to needing these kinds of intensive treatments.
Which tells you immediately this market is tied to a really fundamental and sadly growing healthcare need.
Absolutely.
The report paints a picture right from the start of some pretty significant expansion over the coming decade.
It really does. The big picture numbers give a clear trajectory. If we look back to 2021, the global market for Busulfan generated $295.4 million.
Okay, so a decent starting point, almost 300 million.
Exactly, a solid base.
Mm.
And that's projected to climb, pretty steadily near term. It should hit around $380 million by 2025.
Okay, so healthy progress just in the next couple of years.
Right. But where it gets really interesting is looking, further down the line. By 2033, the forecast actually sees that market size more than doubling from where it was in 2021.
More than doubling.
Yeah, reaching $628.9 million.
Wow, nearly doubling in, 12 years? What kind of average growth rate are we talking about over that whole period?
So over the full forecast period, 2021 right through to 2033, the report calculates a compound annual growth rate, the CAGR, at 6.5%.
6.5%. That's pretty strong, consistent growth for a specific drug market over a decade plus.
It is definitely robust.
So what are the main forces the report says are behind this kind of, steady, significant expansion?
Well, the source is quite clear on the main drivers. First, the increasing number of cancer cases worldwide that actually require bone marrow transplants.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, a growing preference, or maybe adoption, of this specific chemo conditioning method. And third, significantly expanding access.
Access to these specialty pharmaceuticals.
Exactly. Access in healthcare systems everywhere, both in well-established economies and, importantly, in emerging ones, too.
So it's a mix of more people needing the treatment, disease prevalence, basically, and also more people actually being able to get this specific part of the treatment.
Precisely.
And framing this for you, the listener, this projected growth, it's not just numbers on a page. It really tells us a lot about the ongoing and in some places accelerating global demand for these very specific, very critical medical treatments in the fight against cancer and related diseases.
But that demand, it doesn't look the same everywhere, you know?
Ah, right. And this is where we can really dig into the variations, which I always find fascinating. Let's break it down. Region by region. Where's this growth happening most strongly? How do different parts of the world stack up?
Yeah, the report shows some pretty distinct regional dynamics. North America, for instance, is currently the heavyweight, the biggest piece of the global market.
And does it stay the leader throughout the forecast period?
Yes, absolutely. It starts at $114.9 million back in 2021.
Okay.
And it's projected to reach $222.6 million by 2033. So still the largest. Its CAGR over that time is solid 5.6%.
Slightly below the global average. You said 6.5% globally.
Right, a bit below, but remember, it's starting from that very large base.
And within North America, I assume the U.S. is the lion's share of that.
It is, yes. The United States was the largest contributor by a significant margin.
Yeah.
Makes up the bulk of that North American figure. Its growth rate is actually slightly lower than the regional average, around 5.3%.
But even within that leading region, you still see different speeds of growth?
Exactly. That's a key point the source makes. Canada, for example, actually shows a higher growth rate within North America. Its CAGR is pegged at 7.1%.
Oh, interesting.
And Mexico also shows healthy growth, right around that global average, 6.5%. So it just shows, even in a mature market like North America, the pace isn't uniform across the board.
Okay, let's shift gears. Across the Atlantic now, Europe. What's the story there?
Europe comes in as the second largest market globally. And it shows, well, pretty steady increase, largely mirroring that global average growth. It's forecast to grow from $84.5 million in 2021
Right.
up to $172.9 million by 2033. That works out to a 6.2% CGR. So very much in line with the overall trend.
Yeah, a couple. The UK actually shows a standout CAGR of 7.4%.
Oh, faster than the regional average then.
Yep. indicating faster growth in many of its European neighbors. Germany, on the other hand, remains the largest single market.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Its European neighbors. Germany, on the other hand, remains the largest single market in Europe in absolute dollar terms, and it sees significant growth too.
And the report also lists, several other major European players, France, Italy, Russia, Spain. But they're all showing pretty solid growth, generally in that kind of 6-7% CAGR range. It illustrates really widespread demand across the continent.
Even if the specific numbers vary a bit, maybe due to different healthcare systems.
Exactly. Those structures definitely impact the specific figures you see country by country. Even places like Luxembourg are included, smaller but still growing.
Okay. Now, the report flagged one region, I think, with significantly higher momentum than the others.
That would be Asia Pacific. Yeah, this region really demonstrates dynamic growth in this market.
How dynamic are we talking?
Well, the report shows sales jumping from $66.6 million in 2021 to a projected $166.3 million by 2033. That gives a really robust 7.9% CAGR.
7.9%. Wow, that's significantly above the global average.
Well above. And the source even notes it's expected to more than double just between 2025 and 2033 alone.
So accelerating growth later in the period.
That's what the forecast suggests, yes. And if you look closer within the region, you see where that energy is coming from. China is the largest single market there, showing strong growth.
Right.
But India has the highest KGR mentioned, not just in the region, but among all the specific countries highlighted in the report. It's at a remarkable 9.9%.
Wow, nearly 10% growth annually, sustained for over a decade.
That really underlines one of those core drivers you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. That kind of explosive growth in countries like India and the strong pace in China, too, it directly reflects what the report identified, that expanding access to these specialty pharmaceuticals in, these rapidly developing economies.
As healthcare improves, treatments become more available.
Exactly. More available, maybe more affordable. You see it directly impacting the demand captured in these market numbers. And it's not just them. Japan, South Korea also contribute significantly. And Australia actually has a very strong KGR too, 9.2%.
Australia at 9.2%?
Yeah.
Okay, so real dynamism across Asia Pacific then.
Definitely. Southeast Asia also showing growth. Okay, let's quickly touch on Latin America next.
Latin America also shows, healthy growth, contributing nicely to the global picture. Brazil is the biggest market in that region.
And its growth rate.
Pretty strong, 7.4% CAGR projected. Argentina also shows good growth.
Are there similar pockets of faster growth there, like we saw with Canada or India?
Yes, actually. The report points to Peru. That's got a 7.9% CAGR. Pretty high. And notably, Chile seems to have the fastest growth rate in this specific region, coming in at 8.3%.
8.3% for Chile. Okay, so again, diverse speeds of development even within one area.
Exactly. Colombia is mentioned too. Solid growth there as well.
And finally, the Middle East and Africa region.
Yeah, the Middle East and Africa shows steady progress. Not quite the explosive growth of Asia Pacific, but definitely moving forward. The report highlights Egypt specifically with a 7.1% CAGR.
Okay.
And other markets like Turkey and sort of a rest of Middle East category also contributing to the growth. It reflects, increasing availability of these kinds of treatments in parts of that region too.
So let's bring this all back together then, for you, the listener. How do all these specific regional numbers, all these different growth rates, help us understand that bigger global picture and those initial drivers we talked about?
Well, they showed us exactly how those drivers are playing out on the ground, so to speak. You see the large established markets, North America, Europe, providing this significant stable base of demand. That's tied to their existing mature healthcare system. But then you see the higher growth rates, particularly in many parts of Asia Pacific and also Latin America. And that clearly illustrates the impact of that expanding access, the developing healthcare infrastructure in those emerging economies.
So the data really connects the dots visually between the global health needs and these market development opportunities.
Absolutely. And the report's conclusion really reinforces that. It frames the market opportunities across both developed and developing healthcare systems.
Makes sense.
The data tells us, look, the global demand is driven by this fundamental need for life-saving treatments. But the rate at which that market is growing varies quite a lot.
And that variation reflects.
It reflects different stages of healthcare system development, different levels of investment, and just the speed at which access to these kinds of specialty treatments is expanding around the world.
Okay, so to quickly recap this deep dive then, The global market for Busulfan, this critical drug for bone marrow transplants, for cancer treatment conditioning, it's on a really solid multi-year growth path, forecast to nearly double by 2033.
Hmm.
And this isn't random. It's fueled by, well, the undeniable reality of rising cancer cases, and just as importantly, the crucial expansion of access to these advanced therapies worldwide.
That really is the core story these numbers tell.
Right.
While regions like North America and Europe, they provide that large, stable base. The truly dynamic growth, the momentum, driven by increasing availability, is most evident in places like Asia-Pacific and parts of Latin America.
Right. And maybe here's a final thought, a provocative one for you to consider, just looking at the numbers we've unpacked here.
Okay.
Given that significant range in market sizes, hundreds of millions in North America down to much smaller figures in many individual countries, and that wide variation in projected growth rates we saw, region by region, country by country, what might this data suggest about the current, let's say, equity of access to these critical, potentially life-saving therapies around the globe?
That's a really important question.
Or maybe what does it imply about the differing rates at which the underlying conditions, the ones requiring this treatment, are actually being diagnosed and then addressed in different parts of the world? Definitely something to chew on. Welcome to the Deep Dive. You've brought us a really interesting angle today, a market report on the drug Busulfan. It's quite specific, giving us this commercial snapshot of a pretty critical medication.
Absolutely. Busulfan is really a cornerstone for certain treatments. And yeah, this report helps us see beyond just the medicine itself. We get into the market stuff, what's driving demand, what the roadblocks are, and maybe where things are heading.
Okay, great. So let's unpack the source. What's the fundamental driver for Busulfan, according to this report? Like, what's its main job?
Well, its absolute core function is pre-transplant conditioning. So for patients with serious blood cancers, think things like myelofibrosis or certain leukemias.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Blood cancers, think things like myelofibrosis or certain leukemias or even some genetic disorders. Busulfan helps prepare their body for a bone marrow or stem cell transplant.
Ah, okay, so it's about clearing the way, essentially.
Exactly. Clearing out the existing cells and kind of suppressing the immune system so the body doesn't reject the new graft.
And the report links that to wider trends, doesn't it? Like, the aging population means more of these cancers, which then means more need for these transplants and Busulfan.
Precisely. Yeah, the report explicitly mentions that. And it gives examples, points to its standard use in, say, leukemia transplants in places like the U.S. and Germany.
What caught my eye, though, was the pediatric angle. The report suggests it's increasingly important there, too.
Yes, absolutely. It's definitely not just for adults. For conditions like thalassemia major or childhood AL, that's acute lymphoblastic leukemia, Busulfan is part of the standard playbook. The report mentions the UK and Japan using it in their protocols as a whole other layer to the demand.
Okay, so clearly vital for saving lives through transplants. That's a strong driver. But the report is also pretty blunt about the challenges. What's the biggest hurdle mentioned?
The narrow therapeutic index. That's a really key point. It basically means the dose that works is very, very close to the dose that can cause serious harm.
Harm, like what specifically?
Well, we're talking potentially severe side effects. Things like hepatic veno-occlusive disease, a serious liver issue, seizures, even pulmonary fibrosis, which affects the lungs. It's serious stuff.
And that narrow window means it's not straightforward to use. You need heavy-duty monitoring, careful dose changes.
Exactly. You can't just, hand it out easily. And the report points out this limits its use where that kind of infrastructure, where it's lacking.
Right, like in lower resource settings, maybe?
Precisely. Safely giving Busulfan needs sophisticated hospital setups, for monitoring drug levels, managing toxicities if they pop up. The report flags this as a real challenge in places like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Southeast Asia.
Okay. And what about competition? Are there other drugs eating into its market?
Yes, the report mentions that too. Newer alternatives like fludarabine and treosulfan are out there. Often they have, let's say, better side effect profiles.
Safer, maybe?
Potentially, yeah, especially for patients who might be older or more frail. So doctors might prefer those options sometimes, which naturally affects Busulfan's use.
And then there's the cost. That's flagged as a restraint, too.
Right. It's not just the price tag on the vial. It's the whole package. The hospitalization, the supportive care needed, the monitoring after the transplant, it all adds up, and that total cost can be a big barrier, particularly in cost-conscious healthcare systems.
So a vital drug, but risky, needs careful handling, and it's expensive overall. Where do the opportunities lie then, according to this source?
Well, one major trend is developing new formulations. Think intravenous IV and liposomal versions. These are kind of a big deal.
How so? What's the advantage?
They offer better bioavailability, meaning the body absorbs and uses the drug more consistently. This leads to more controlled, more predictable dosing, which helps manage that narrow therapeutic window we talked about, less variability.
Makes sense. And the report sees this happening in practice.
Yeah, it gives examples like IV Busulfan being the go-to in big transplant centers in the U.S. and South Korea, precisely because of that better control.
Interesting. And geographically, any hotspots for growth?
Definitely the Asia-Pacific region. The report highlights it as a major area for rapid market expansion.
Places like China and India, what's fueling that?
It's kind of a mix. You've got rising rates of blood cancer diagnoses, better access to transplant procedures than before, and crucially, the availability of generic versions is growing, making it more affordable.
So more need, more access, better prices.
Pretty much. The report talks about a surge in demand in big city hospitals, mentions Beijing and Mumbai as examples.
And one last thing, regulatory support. The report mentions orphan drug status.
Yes, that's important. For drugs treating relatively rare diseases, getting orphan drug status in places like the U.S. and Europe is a big incentive for companies. It offers benefits like tax breaks, market exclusivity for a time, maybe faster approvals. It basically encourages investment in R&D for these critical but maybe smaller market therapies.
Okay, so we've followed Busulfan through this report. Its essential role driving demand, the serious risks and access issues holding it back, and then these new chances through better formulations and growing markets, plus regulatory help. You've just got a really concise picture of all the forces shaping this specific market.
It really does show how it all connects, doesn't it? The medical need, the safety concerns, the economics, the regulations, they all weave together to define how a drug actually fares out there in the real world, even one that's been around a while.
So here's something for you to think about after this deep dive. How does this constant push and pull between incredibly powerful, life-saving drugs that also carry significant risks and the uneven global access to the healthcare needed to use them safely and affordably keep shaping medicine and markets around the world?
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.